Their rail division is separate, Bombardiers. Of course, much attention on that down here across the border in the Plattsburgh area, in the North Country, because of the Bombardier rail plant here. They have sold a stake in their company, though, recently. Is the rail division seeing a downturn, and is that the need for looking for an outside investor to come in?
Well, the Caisse de Depot, which is the huge pension fund, which is all Quebecers' pension, and some other money as well, that they invested and got, as I recall, 30% of the rail division. They see it as a good investment opportunity. So we had Michael Sabia, the CEO, come to class, and he said, it's a great investment. It wasn't a bailout. He saw it as a hard-nosed business decision. And they're actually, the Caisse has funded a big growth in trains in the Montreal area. They see it as something where it's the future of travel to a considerable degree in the more densely populated parts of the world from a climate change and a traffic viewpoint. The transportation, it's really half the company, but it's one headquartered in Berlin, and we somewhat overlook it here in Montreal because aviation's more the focus in the Montreal area. It has had some problems, without a doubt. They brought in some new executives, and they had problems delivering on these big contracts. But rail is in a growth mode in China, India, other parts of the world. It's a huge thing in Europe and Japan. So I think the long term is a bright future, because this is where transportation is going to a very considerable degree.
Speaking of rail, for a number of years, the U.S. and Canada have been trying to work out a deal where they put customs agents in Canada. They're already in airports. Now they're going to put them in train stations, Central Station in Montreal. That is moving forward. Canada just needs to sign off on that. The U.S. has. Having pre-inspection so that you don't have to stop at the border. Saving an hour 15 at the border, do you think that'll increase tourism and people bringing the train south from Montreal to Albany and on to New York City?
I think it will help a bit. It goes from, I guess, about 10 hours when people tell me to 8.5. That's good, but it's not high-speed rail, where when you really compete with airlines is when you're down to, if it was 3 hours, something like that, 3 or 4 hours, where you go. In fact, I drive to New York usually, because by the time I go to the airport, wait and go through customs and all that, and then fly down to New Jersey and then go over, it's probably about 6 hours, where I drive down in about 7 hours. So it's almost, and that way I can take other people in the car with me. Excuse me. So it's something where, but when you get it down to 3 or 4 hours, then we would see huge growth, but there'd be such billions of dollars required to set up the rails and get the new trains. I don't think it's going to happen.
So many Canadians cross the border to fly out of Plattsburgh. Right now they're taking charter flights to the south, mostly to Florida. Plans are moving along now. There's been a huge expansion at the airport here in Plattsburgh. They are going to put customs there as well. Do you see a future putting customs there? They're already talking about flights to the Caribbean, to Mexico, possibly someday to Europe. Do you see this still being a top destination for Canadians for potentially international flights down the road in the years ahead?
Well, to get to the Plattsburgh airport as a Canadian, you've got to go through the border. So I went through it this morning with Nexus, almost not quite flew through it, but very, very rapidly. So I think it's something where Plattsburgh is attractive because of the cost of the flights, and that's the central thing. You'd rather go to Montreal. It's a little bit more of a drive, though on the South Shore it may not be much difference when you go across the Champlain Bridge. It's really the cost. That's the central thing driving that. And as the cost stays down, it'll continue to be attractive to Montrealers.
Does the airport in Montreal look at what business it's losing here and not like that, and anything that they may be trying to do to try to win that business back?
Oh yeah, I've talked to Jim Cherry, who just stepped down, was CEO of Airports of Montreal for a long time, and absolutely it's a concern for them. And you got to weigh what are our advantages. And they've gone after big international airlines and said, you should fly to Montreal. Here's the data from IATA about people are going from Italy to Toronto, then to Montreal. Why don't you have a direct flight? So they're absolutely out there selling airlines and making Montreal a destination. But they recognize we don't have a low-cost carrier. In Canada, WestJet is no longer a low cost. And so it's just the nature, there's a better offering at sometimes here. And they've got to improve the offering in Montreal, and they see it as a competitive game that they want to win as much as they can. But there's a legitimate part for Plattsburgh and all that.
There's been a thawing of relations with Cuba, certainly under the Obama administration. Whether that continues under Trump remains to be seen. But there has been talk now about flights from Montreal or from Plattsburgh direct to Cuba. A number of airlines have started up commercial service flying into Cuba. Cuba is a popular vacation destination spot for many Canadians. Do you think flights out of Plattsburgh nonstop to Cuba would be a hit among people in Montreal?
Oh, as long as the price is the right point. But Canadians have gone to Cuba for decades, and so saw some friends a weekend that were in Cuba 2 weeks ago, but we've been going for a long time. So it's something where it's more new to the U.S., but Canadians have been going for long, very used to it, have friends that have been there if they haven't been there themselves. So I think an offering at Plattsburgh would be very attractive.
But it'd have to be a good price. That's
Absolutely.
what would bring
Yeah.
them down.
Why come all that way if you can go to your local airport? And there might be a little bit of buy Canadian, but I think price can overcome that fairly rapidly.
And speaking of the border, we've seen hundreds of immigrants from the United States worried about the crackdown on immigration under President Trump, fleeing the United States, crossing the border, coming through northern New York and crossing across the border in Quebec into Hemingford. Canada welcoming them, allowing them to come in, arresting them, detaining them, letting them go through the process of seeking asylum. Do you think at some point, the Prime Minister has said that he has no intention of stopping that flow, but do you think at some point it may get to, if you have hundreds turning into thousands, that Canada may start questioning letting so many come in when they're spending resources on arresting them for RCMP, having them at the border 24/7, caring for them until these folks have their hearings? Do you see a point where people may say we need to stop the flow or slow the flow?
There may be a point, I mean, in theory there certainly is, but it's part of Canada's self-image that we are an immigrant nation, as the U.S. is, but it's something where we're more welcoming, is the Prime Minister's approach. Most Canadians are behind that. We see there's problems with Angela Merkel, what they've done in Germany, but the numbers are quite different, and we're a long way from that issue being an issue in Canada. So it's something where our own self-image and our view of who we are would have us take a lot more people, but it's also how are they integrating within Canadian society? Are they having problems? That, if there's problems there, might lead to it eventually. But at this point, I think it's something that we're pleased with ourselves, and it fits with our approach to immigration and has been for a long time.
You had 40,000 Syrian refugees come a year earlier, so you're nowhere near that number.
By and large, it seems to have worked out well. From the viewpoint of press reports, it seems to be going well, where we see vastly different numbers in Germany and other parts of Europe where there has been problems. So certainly there's an eye on that, but at this point it seems to have gone well.
We talk about Canadians. Did they closely watch the election, do you think, many, and are now watching the first few months of the Trump administration, and do you get a sense what Canadians are thinking?
Oh, we were transfixed, but the world was transfixed. I mean, I doubt there was not many Canadians who went to bed that night, just because it's such an important election. You're by far our biggest trading partner. You're the most important country in the world. So the world is transfixed by it, and it was just, what an incredible election and an incredible result, where most Canadians would not support President Trump, but we came to realize our beloved friends to the south, a lot of Americans supported. There must have been some reason why. And we see other parts of the world where that same pushing back against people that see themselves losing from globalization, we have some of that in Canada as well, because some people have been negatively hurt. So we are absolutely interested in President Trump, and hoping and literally praying at times that he become more presidential, and he has on some occasions, and that is something that we just rejoice, as many Americans do as well, that he would simply act the part of being a good president, and we just absolutely hope that he becomes a good president.
Are many Canadians worried about either the state of U.S.-Canada relations or what may happen?
I don't think we're worried about the state of U.S.-Canadian relations. They're so deep and they've been around so long for hundreds of years, and it's such a warm relationship overall. There is some concern about President Trump and the policies that his administration might be put in place. And they're not aimed at Canada, but it might be collateral damage. I think that's the main concern. And it's also that the president's simply the most important figure in the world. We want him or her to do a sound job. And so something where it makes us slightly nervous if you're not sound in your judgments. And everyone is going to make mistakes and fall short, but we just think the president is someone that is terribly important, and we just hope that they do the best they can.
And we talk with you almost every year now. As we mentioned, you're an associate professor at the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. Every year you take students on what you call the Hot Cities Tour, where you basically go around the globe to visit countries where there are emerging economies, and you're just back from this year's trip. Where did you go this year on the tour?
Well, we went to Hong Kong for a couple days, then Manila and Palawan, so in the Philippines. We went to Hong Kong because you can't go from Montreal to Manila directly. And we have thousands of alumni in Hong Kong, some great meetings, and a chance to see it as an emerged country in contrast to an emerging economy. And China is an emerging economy. Hong Kong is part of it, and gives you a unique window to see China as well. So it was a chance to look at the two in contrast. The slogan of the trip is taking the future to the future. So 30 undergraduates and a dozen inspiring alumni to where the world economy is growing. And the Philippines has had one of the strongest growing economies in that part of the world for a number of years now. So we wanted to go see, look at that growth and see how are things different there than back home in Canada and the U.S.
Certainly the president there quite outspoken in recent months about relationships with the United States. Who did you get to see and visit in the Philippines?
Well, we met with a couple billionaires, so very wealthy business families, conglomerates. We also met with the former president, who had been president of the Philippines for 8 years, before that vice president, and she was the president 2 ago, so fairly recent, a big supporter of the current president. And the central question we wanted to ask her, and we asked literally hundreds of Filipinos, from billionaires down to millennials that work at these companies to people in the slums, is what do you think of the president? We've done an analysis of the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Economist, and the Globe and Mail, is some of the leading press in the English-speaking world, and it was largely negative about the new president. So part of the question we had over there is that we see him negatively. What do you think, Madam President? And asked her, and we asked the billionaires, and asked other leading business people, and it became a more nuanced view, where almost to a person they condemned his not following the rule of law in terms of the battle against drugs. That was seen negatively, but they said, one is drugs are a bigger problem here than you think, and it may be true or not, but it's certainly that impression. The other thing which is really interesting is that he showed for decades as the mayor of a major city a real concern for poverty, and he's taken actions around helping the poorest people, which there are a lot of in the Philippines. He's actually said, and it's on the website of the party, they're socialist. And what we see is that that's a very positive, seen very positively by a lot of people. They give him credit. In fact, we met with 3 former cabinet ministers from the former president. So Harper or Obama versus the current one, and you would expect them to be negative, which they were, but they also gave him some due credit around his concern for poverty and for putting people, business people in the cabinet, Minister of Finance, that sort of thing. We met with the son-in-law of the Minister of Finance, for example, where he's letting those people who understand business and the economy do their thing and not try to micromanage. So we came back with a sense of he shouldn't do some of the things doing in the war against drugs, and that's covered very adequately by the press, but he's doing some positive things around poverty and change in the economy, which actually he got a fair bit of credit for.
And President Duterte has talked about cutting ties with the United States and possibly aligning with Russia or China. If he follows that path, how does that impact the economy there?
Well, it's interesting because he seems to like President Trump better than President Obama, so that looks helpful for the future. What we see is that, and we've seen this, this is our 9th trip, 7 of them in that part of the world, and we've seen this in Africa as well, where China is becoming a more important economic player over the last 20 years than it has been before. And many countries talk about the importance of China. Now the Philippines, it used to be called the South China Sea, they call it the Philippine Sea, but they're very close to China. That it's a natural part of what China's doing is to be more drawn into their orbit, which is something the U.S. has, as the other great power in the world, has to deal with. But he seems more friendly to the U.S. When you go and talk to Filipinos, they speak English, they love America to a very large degree, and Canada, because there's so many Filipinos in both our countries, there's a very natural tie. We talked to the CEO of Microsoft, they have a huge business process outsourcing. A lot of that is serving the U.S. and Canada, so that they take phone calls and that sort of thing over there from the U.S. So he seems to be taking a more nuanced view towards the U.S., but one of the big messages we come back from these trips, particularly to Asia, is that China is on the rise very much and is rightly and perhaps overly aggressively moving its way forward, and the U.S. has got to give considerable thought to what that means. In Canada, we've tried to develop the relationships under Harper and now under Trudeau more with China because it's part of being a Pacific country.
The leaders you met with, they look at the new president here in the United States, President Trump. Do they see a nation that is anti-globalization, and how do they react to that?
Well, they would see it as being perhaps anti-globalization, but there's a sense that globalization benefited the rich and the poor in India and China, other parts of the world. So the poor, and that's great, we're all happy, but it seems to have hurt the middle class more than we anticipated. I've studied globalization for about 20 years, written a number of books on it, and 20 years ago we saw it as an unalloyed good, where today we go, actually, it's hurt some people and helped many. So the world is rethinking globalization, and part of China is the element of that. And so we see this with the Brexit, we see it in Europe, we see that with Angela Merkel, the election, with Marine Le Pen. The world's rethinking globalization and how should it morph, and we're at a point of uncertainty, Tom, in terms of where it's going to go. And the world is really just someone's holding its breath to see how it evolves, but the U.S. is clearly a central player in that.
And the U.S., where they look and take a step back from the Trans-Pacific deal, Canada and Prime Minister Trudeau, on the other hand, moving forward and looking at a different type of alliance.
Well, I think Canada's economy is very dependent on the U.S. and on global trade. It's not as strong a domestic market or big a domestic market, it's a tenth the size roughly of the U.S., where we've got to be that international player by virtue of the economy, and the Conservatives under Harper's viewed that as well. So I think it's partly the liberal philosophy, but it's the nature of Canada's economy, and it's the integration we have in Quebec with France and with the UK because of our historical ties, and the US by all sorts of ties, from sports to travel to tourism to our economies. So I think the U.S. has a little bit more slack there to play with it than Canada might have.
For a few years now, you've hosted a radio program called the CEO Series. You sit down with the movers and shakers of Canada, mostly in politics, but business leaders, and have pretty candid conversations with them. Who have you talked with in recent months on the program?
Well, we sat down with the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, so that was very interesting, in Toronto with him. And one of the questions was, the press is accused of having liberal bias, and he said absolutely, that we hire almost all the university grads, that we're in Toronto downtown, that we do have a liberal view on the world, but when it comes to a post-truth world, the Globe and Mail, like the New York Times, and we met with the editor of the New York Times for Asia, and they have 30 or 40 people in Hong Kong. It was quite interesting that the Globe and Mail, the New York Times, I think are doing a good job of the traditions of journalism at its best, where we take a more neutral view and we provide both sides of the story, that there actually is truth in a post-truth world, which speaks to journalism at its best. Mm-hmm. So that was quite fascinating to see. Sat down with former Prime Minister Paul Martin, his concern about Aboriginals. Trying to think who else more recently. Doing some interviews in Europe in the next couple months, and down in New York, seeing the former editor-chief economist who's now at Bloomberg, scheduled to see Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, and the new head of Cambridge University, who was the Dean of Law at McGill grad himself, and then seeing the head of Oxford University as well. So it's something where trying to get more international players. Mohammed Yunus, Nobel Prize winner, quite fascinating to talk to him about microcredit and its evolution. So it's a neat opportunity to talk about specific issues, but also about leadership and how their leadership has changed. And I'm doing a book on introverted or quiet leaders, and a surprising number of the senior leaders are introverts rather than extroverts, which is kind of a traditional view of what leadership's about. So that's fascinating.
Would that surprise a lot of people, that they're introverts?
Well, when we look at it, probably it's about a third, and I've interviewed 250 CEOs and other C-suite executives, so they're all very senior leaders in big organizations. About a third are introverts, a third are ambiverts, a third are extroverts, which is the basic distribution in our general population in the US and Canada. But what the central point is they make is two things which are interesting. One is that the introverts say they've got to put on their game face and act like an extrovert as CEO or as a senior executive. Now, I've argued as an extrovert myself, to be a better leader when I leave my office, I need to put on my game face and act like an introvert to be a better leader. And they would both see that they learn from the other and act like an extrovert at times and introvert at times. But their own hardwiring as an introvert, so they need that break and get away from people. When I'm writing a book now, I'm spending hours in my office writing, I need extrovert breaks, where I go down to the second floor where there's an infinite supply of undergraduates, so they're generally happy to see me. But these days they'll grin at me and go, extrovert break? And then they'll talk to me for a while. So you understand the hard wiring. The other thing is that as you become a senior executive, you talk less, listen more. Because I already know what I know. What I'm interested in is my millennials, particularly, what are they understanding? How are they seeing the world? So we can evolve the strategy of our organization. So those are two things that strike me that are particularly interesting from the research.
And folks, if they want to hear it, they can go to the CJAD website and listen to your CEO series. Karl Moore, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Always a pleasure, Tom.